Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Christi Craddick. Thank you so much. Welcome. Good to see you.
Good morning, thank you.
I thought we might do some Tuesday stuff first and then get into the meat and potatoes of energy, if that's okay. But we're going to start, weirdly, with Tuesday with energy, and that's the Denton fracking ban, which passed on Tuesday. I know the tendency since Tuesday has been to dismiss the Denton fracking vote as the work of damn dirty hippies. It's been sort of like harumph, college town, harumph.
I haven't really called it that.
Well, you haven't. No, of course, no. Well, you're chairman. No, you're too much decorum. You wouldn't actually.
No, but even before that, I wouldn't say that I think it's...
But you know that the reaction to this has been, well, this is an isolated deal. And, you know, I looked up the vote. Nearly 59% of residents approved the Denton fracking ban. More people in Denton approved the ban than supported Dan Patrick, Glenn Hager, or Ryan Sitton statewide. And lest anybody think that Denton is, to borrow Governor Perry's phrase, a blueberry in the tomato soup, Denton County voted 2-1 for Greg Abbott. So this is not like Austin voting for a fracking ban. Can you help us understand what happened here? Do you have a sense?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I wouldn't say that Denton is not like Austin in the fact it has 3 universities in it. So it is more liberal as a city than a community.
Right, but more conservative politically than a lot of other places in the state. Yeah.
You know, I think it's unfortunate, first and foremost, that that's the choice that they've made right now. Because I think it's going to cost their city some dollars.
From an economic standpoint.
From an economic standpoint, first and foremost, because it's not just about oil and gas, despite the fact that they think it is.
Yeah.
It's also about jobs. Every oil and gas job creates about 10 to 18 in this state. So those are real dollars to a community.
Right.
But it's also, and I've said this historically, I think that as an industry and potentially as an agency too, when oil and gas came to the Barnett Shale heavily in 2006, we missed as far as an education process and explaining what fracking is, explaining what was going on up there. And I think this is the results of that in a lot of respects, and a lot of misinformation about fracking. And so I will say to the city of Denton, I think you've gotten sued already twice yesterday.
Texoga and the Texas General Land Office, both
General Land Office. And there was
jumped on it first of the morning.
And there was a suit actually filed about 3 or 4 weeks before that from mineral interest owners. And I will tell you, I believe it's my job to give permits, not Denton. So I think there's going to be some legal things that go on from a lot of sides that again cost that city dollars.
Will the Railroad Commission get in on this and sue?
We're looking to see what our options are and to see, but we're going to continue permitting up there because that's my job. Right,
but you haven't foreclosed as an agency on joining into or possibly filing your own suit.
We are having conversations, so we'll see where we get in the next few weeks.
Do you begrudge the citizens of Denton the opportunity to cast this vote? My colleague Jim Malowitz a few weeks ago interviewed you after you were elected chairman by your fellow commissioners. He asked you, should cities be allowed to regulate, this was specifically on the Denton question, should cities be allowed to regulate that aspect of drilling if that's what they decide they want? And your response was personally no.
And I still agree with that.
I thought you guys on the Republican side of the line liked local control.
Local control's great.
Yeah.
On a lot of respects, but I think you've got a lot. I'm the expert in oil and gas. The city of Denton is not. And I don't know if you know the history of the city of Denton and how this got here.
Share.
But I think it's interesting, and it's a story that's not been told.
Okay.
First and foremost, I think cities do have the right to do setbacks for health and safety. That is their job. That is their right.
Right.
But it's my job to give oil and gas drilling permits. That's what we do at the Railroad Commission. We're the expert on it. What happened in the city of Denton, the permits were sitting there, and historically, until a few years ago, their fire department did the health and safety for Denton, and they're the ones who issued other additional drilling permits or additional permission to drill within their city limits.
Yeah.
They issued permits that had no end. So the company that is up in Denton that kind of started this brouhaha, the recent one, had the right to drill, and these permits have been good for 10 plus years. Communities have built around them. So they had the right to drill. They didn't do anything wrong. Where I think we've still got a challenge as an industry, and frankly as an agency potentially, is companies need to understand they have a social right to operate too in these communities, and they need to be partners within these communities and educate them and tell people what's going on, be good citizens, go above and beyond if they have to, if you're in the middle of a neighborhood, beyond what we require. And so they didn't do anything wrong. It was we are not happy that we have people now drilling in my neighborhood, but
Yep.
10 years ago those neighborhoods weren't there.
So your position, just to be clear on this, is that the citizens of Denton, whether or not they've cast this vote, there may actually just be, from a process standpoint, it may be irrelevant what they've done because
It might be, and I'm not sure how they enforce it either,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah.
Because you've banned fracking. Well, if you're in the Barnett Shale, frankly, the only way you can get the natural gas out of the ground is to frack.
Yeah.
But fracking's one process. It's not about drilling the well. Fracking's 3 days of a 5-week process on
Yeah.
a well. It's one process, and I think we've been fracking. The education piece is this. We've been fracking in this country and in this state for
Yeah.
60 years. We started it, frankly,
Right.
up in the Barnett Shale. And people think it's new. And it's not new. The technology has greatly increased, obviously, but it is not new.
Right.
And it's safe.
One last bit on this before we move on to the rest of the results on Tuesday. The assumption has been following this that this may be like a virus that spreads. Denton has voted for a fracking ban. Now everyone's going to want one. What do you do about that?
I think that it's going to end up being a legislative fix long term.
Legislative.
I
So you
think
think
so.
possibly going into the next session, this may be something that spikes up as an issue?
We've already had conversations with people, members.
You
that
happen to have a state representative from that community who is the vice chair of the the Energy Resources Committee in the House.
That's correct.
Somebody with no small interest in this subject.
That's correct. So
Yeah.
I think there are others that we've had conversations with. So I
Right.
think you'll potentially see a legislative fix, and I
Right.
think it'll go through the courthouse.
So Tuesday wasn't a big surprise to a lot of people, the way the election results turned out. I think the margins were a little bit larger than people anticipated.
The margins were a lot bigger than I anticipated.
Right.
Even on Friday before the election, I saw General Abbott, and he said, "Don't tell anybody, but we're 13 points up." They're 20. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think anybody anticipated the margins.
Was he wrong, or did things just get worse for the Democrats between last week and Tuesday?
I think a lot more people came out and voted at the end than historically.
But the turnout was atrocious.
The turnout was horrible.
28.5% according to the numbers I saw yesterday. We're back to being worst in the nation in voter turnout.
Which is unfortunate because I think people can't complain if they don't vote. I've always said that, and I
Right.
tell people to vote anyway. But we, historically as Republicans, and we've watched the trend the last few cycles, we've always voted early. And the last couple of cycles, Republicans have started voting on Election Day for some weird reason.
Right.
So I think that they were looking at what had happened historically and some numbers, and you'll have to ask them exactly what their numbers are. But I don't
Right.
think anybody expected the landslide we got.
Right.
Hopeful for it, but not expected.
Really, the surprise, to the degree that there was a surprise, was there were a couple of legislative seats in San Antonio and Houston that, because the Davis-Vanderpute campaigns were not as strong as had been expected in those communities, and in fact lost Harris County, lost Bexar County, a couple of legislative seats flipped. Congressman Gallego flipped because both Bexar County and El Paso County didn't turn out for the Democrats the way they anticipated. Those were really the meaningful byproducts.
But I would argue that it
Yeah.
wasn't the Democrats not doing their job. I'd argue that Republicans did their job.
Really, you would argue that, would you?
I would.
Okay.
But here's the reality of what Republicans and the Republican Party did, and part of what the victory effort was,
Right.
and part of what General Abbott's,
Yeah.
now Governor Abbott, it's nice to say that,
Yeah.
campaign philosophy was, let's put our people on the ground. We had field offices in Harris
Right.
County and Bexar County, specifically in the now Will Hurd coming up seat. We had a field office in El Paso.
Yep.
And those races that you thought were surprises, we were watching anyway because we thought they had potential.
Well, I think everybody thought that they were potentially going to flip, but again, Senator Vanderpute represents San Antonio. The assumption was that Senator Vanderpute would help. In fact, as recently as the day of the election, I had Republican consultants saying, well, Philip Cortez is probably in trouble and Pete Gallego is probably in trouble, but in the end, we think Vanderpute's going to carry them over the line.
But you haven't watched Bexar County. Because I think, and it surprised me when I ran 2 years ago, Bexar County is a straight 50-50 county.
Right.
And
in fact, Mitt Romney won Pete Gallego's district in the last presidential
That's
election.
right. So I think Bexar County is a lot more Republican than people give it credit for. And I think the other fallacy of an election is
Yeah.
that everybody assumes Hispanics are going to vote Democrat,
Right.
and they don't.
Right.
You can't have, and I think
No more
that's-
monolithic than any other voting group.
That's correct.
Right.
And so when you, as Republicans, we made a true effort. There were 1 million Hispanic outreach touches this cycle.
Right.
That was a real key for us, and with Abbott's campaign, that was a goal.
Yeah.
But not just Hispanic voters, but that was a target area this cycle. And you start talking about your Republican and my Republican values, that we are fiscally conservative, we have the same family values, and Democrats go, well, that's not really what my values are, and they shift and they vote Republican.
Right, and so 44% is what I've heard General Abbott received in that campaign. I have not seen specific numbers on the Latino vote for other statewide, but you have to take that number as a significant improvement over what we know was I think Romney got below 30% of the Latino vote in Texas in 2012.
That's right.
Right.
We were hopeful if they wanted above 40.
Right.
I was hopeful if they got 35 plus that it was
Yeah.
a win in the state. So 44 is
Right.
huge.
How significant is it that General Abbott beat Senator Davis among women? There have been a bunch of Democrats on suicide watch about this particular aspect of the election, but the reality is no Democratic candidate for governor has won the votes of women since Ann Richards in 1990 outright. Richards and Bush tied in 94.
Mm-hmm.
Since that, the Republicans have always won women. I don't see what the big deal is.
I don't either.
Yeah.
I don't know what war on women is. I think some consultants made it up so it'd be the
Right.
buzzword for the campaign, with the campaign cycle.
You all
frankly.
were thinking all along that you were strong with women, and so the
Yes.
outcome of this didn't necessarily surprise you.
No, it didn't
Right.
at all.
Is there a larger takeaway about the medium-term political future of the state? I mean, we can litigate the successes or failures of Battleground Texas for as long as we want. This is really not about Battleground Texas. This is more about the question of whether the politics of Texas are soon going to shift perceptibly. And from this election, look, Senator Davis's result was worse than Tony Sanchez's statewide, which I think if you had asked people 6 weeks or 6 months ago, nobody would have believed. The sense is that maybe rather than progressing forward perceptibly, that there's been a progression backward in this cycle. So how do you read this analysis?
I think that might be a semi-fair analysis in the fact that Republicans finally realized they were complacent. Battleground Texas scared a bunch of us.
Right.
It made us get out and work like we haven't in a while. And,
Yeah.
and there's a new philosophy, I think, with the new candidates that are incoming too. Not that we had a bad philosophy, but for 15 years, the Republican Party's been talking about let's outreach to Hispanics, let's outreach to people we need to outreach to.
Yeah.
And this cycle, we finally did it.
Right.
And once we did and started explaining what the message is, and look, you can't get away from the Texas miracle, and it's happening here. There
Right.
are other states looking to do what we're doing.
But the assumption, Chairman, was that the Texas miracle and whatever other appeal it might have for the Latino voter with regards to the Republican Party might have been trumped by things like illegal invasion, third world conditions, leprosy. You heard a lot of rhetoric early in the campaign that was assumed to be a turnoff for Latinos, but then comes the election day, there doesn't seem to be any indication that that's the case.
Well, look, I don't know if you've been on the border recently, or especially Rio Grande Valley.
Yeah.
We've got 1.3 million people down in a 4-county area.
Yeah.
This is a significant piece of our population in this state, and they're growing every day.
Yeah.
But they see opportunities. But the other thing that if you're down there, you realize they want security on the border because they want safe communities.
Right.
So I don't think the conversation from our end has been leprosy, illegal immigration. I think it's,
Well, that much.
let me say from my end, it's not
Right,
been.
yeah.
I think it's let's make sure we have security on our borders, secure borders, and then let's figure out how we have some job creation. And
Right.
oil and gas is a great opportunity for
Yeah.
our border friends.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the opportunity to change the conversation, frankly.
Well, let's change our conversation to that, because in fact, you just perfectly teed up oil and gas and the boom in the economy. We did an event last Friday at the University of Texas San Antonio about the impact of the shale boom on Texas, and Tom Tunstall, who has become to economic impact what Steve Murdoch is to demographics, was on a panel talking about the impact on the economy, and he had done a report in October analyzing the impact of the shale boom on Texas. He said that for 2013, the projected impact on Texas of the Eagleford was $87 billion all in. And looking out to 2023, he said it would be $137 billion. He had said earlier in the year that the Klein shale, you know well from your part of the world, $14.5 billion impact on the region, not the whole state, in 2012, and could be as much as $30 billion by 2022. So all of our problems in the state solved, we can all go home.
It'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Is that what it, I mean, because, you know, the tendency has been to say, well, the shale boom will come to my house and cook my breakfast, and, you know, it's this amazing thing, it's going to solve all of our problems. On this front, at least, it does seem to be the real deal.
We're moving in the right direction. I
Yeah.
think that when you talk about South Texas, why people, Hispanics are voting, they're seeing jobs. They're seeing reality out of the Eagle Ford.
Yeah.
It's happened very, very quickly, so much more quickly, I'm sure he said, than we expected.
Well, he keeps having to revise his previous year's economic
That's right.
impact because they get out the end of the year and they go, wait a minute, it was more than we
That's right.
thought.
But I think and the Eagle Ford's amazing to me because what's happened down there, but he talks about the Klein Shale, one shale. Remember, in the Permian Basin, we have 10 to 14 plays.
Right.
So it is.
We haven't even started.
We haven't even started.
And the job impact, Mayor Morales was with us on Friday in San Antonio, and we talked about the fact that the unemployment rate in Midland right now is the third lowest in the entire country.
Right.
2.8%.
2.8.
2.8%. You know, he was talking about having to pay signing bonuses, like David Clyde being drafted by the Rangers out of high school to pitch. He was talking about signing bonuses to people who are coming to work for oil and gas companies, and I was just shaking my head thinking, I can't believe I'm hearing that, but I guess that's right.
If you want to work at McDonald's in Midland, Texas, they're paying $15 an hour, and they hope they can keep you.
Because they need to compete with
Everybody else. If you
Right.
go to a restaurant in the Permian Basin, about half of it's open because they don't have wait staff for the other half. It's amazing what's going on. And I think, look, you're going to see some economic booms and ups and downs.
Yeah.
Let me say, I get rid of the boom word. I think it's sustained economic growth.
Why do you get rid of the boom? Is this like a Frank Luntz deal where you're rebranding it so that it doesn't sound so precarious?
No, because I think a boom indicates a bust is coming, and I don't think we're going to see a bust.
Well, but Chairman, you come from a part of the state that knows well not to count your chickens.
That's right.
You know, I drove out to Midland a few months back and with somebody from Midland in the oil business who said to me, you know, there really hasn't been adequate infrastructure in Midland for a lot of the people who are working in the oil boom. There are these tented cities, these what they call man camps, right, out and around, because people in Midland and in the surrounding area remember what happened the last time when they got all heady and they overbuilt and then the bottom dropped out.
It's part of that, but partly I think the growth has exceeded what they can keep up with housing-wise. So
Right.
Good example of the housing market in Midland, Texas, and I think we're seeing it in South Texas too. My parents lived north of town,
Yep.
kind of north side of town. They left town for about 3 weeks vacation, whatever, in April. When they left, a development had started and 2 houses had been started of 40. When they came back 3 weeks later, all 40 houses were up or
Had already been was that
or were
right?
being built. So that's how fast people are trying to catch up. Midland's already grown, they think, since the last census, up to 50,000 plus more people.
Right.
And they expect to have 200,000 people by the time the next census comes.
And
That's
again,
double.
the median income in Midland apparently is top or near the top for the entire country.
It is.
But you could understand why, based on what happened the last time, that people think gravity eventually is going to catch up with you.
People are always
right?
nervous, and I think there's going to be dips. But I think
Right.
where the opportunity really is going forward is this, and it's a national, international conversation. We're seeing the past 3 weeks that the SODs have decided they're going to control the market again and bring
Yeah.
the prices down.
Right.
And-
And while I certainly don't mind paying less than $3 a gallon for gas, I do think about what is the impact on this sustained economic success.
And there are 34 states who now have oil and gas. So it's
Yeah.
not just Texas, by the way.
Right.
It affects everybody. We are probably affected, maybe less because we've diversified, but we also have more of it. But you go to Ohio, the prices dip, there's no incentive to try to develop there, right?
Right.
But the infrastructure is always a challenge. That's a good challenge to have. I'd rather have growth instead of no economic
Right.
growth. So that's always going to be a problem. But you look at what the SODs are doing. I think with our friends in Mexico and Canada, we've got a real opportunity with the resources we now have and that we know we had but can develop in this country
Yeah.
to be energy independent. But we've got to do one thing, and it's a national vote, and that's open our oil markets long term. People don't understand that you can export everything but unrefined crude in this country, and we're beginning to see some of the repercussions. So oil dropped below 80 this past week
Right.
on the Brent, but that meant it was 67 at the wellhead in Midland. in the Permian Basin, and that begins to shut wells down. Or
At some point,
down.
that begins to have an effect. Let me ask about the effect on the Railroad Commission first, and then I want to broaden it to talk about some of the issues that have come up in the are we victims of our own success category. So one of the things I've heard you talk about is whether with all this growth, does the Railroad Commission have adequate permitting capacity and adequate pipeline inspection capacity? This is a little bit like what happened with the TEA a few years ago when the budget cuts came and the TEA's budget had to get cut, but they wanted to approve all these additional charter operators. People began to ask, well, do you have an adequate number of inspectors at TEA to be sure that the good charters are operating, but that the Deion Sanders type charters maybe aren't operating? So I ask a similar version of this with you all. So growth has come. The Railroad Commission's budget theoretically has not increased demonstrably in all this.
Right.
Do you have adequate permitting and inspection capability to keep up with it?
I think that's our challenge, and that's one of the things we're going to the legislature again to ask for.
Right.
Last cycle, if some people remember, we went and asked for ability, and we're one of those truth and budgeting agencies. We're bringing in a lot more than we're spending, by the way.
Yeah.
But we went and put 20 more pipeline safety inspectors in our pipeline safety inspection division last cycle.
Is that enough? You added 20 more on top of how many?
On top of about 50, 60 that were sitting.
So a significant percentage increase.
We did,
Yeah.
and we're asking for another 41 this cycle,
Right.
because we do have a lot of growth going on, and that's pipeline safety only.
Right.
We're asking for an additional 188 people, or the ability to hire an additional 188 people coming up in this next cycle, because we've cut our agency so much, and
Right.
and you're right, we're behind. And I think we are better than any other agency in the country, by the way. We were at one point at 45 days to get a permit out.
Yep.
We're now, if you're calling us or getting a permit, we can do it in hours if we have to, but give us a week lag time, that'd be nice.
Be nice.
But we've caught up, and we're partly doing that with IT upgrades that we got money from this last cycle from the legislature.
Doesn't it make sense, Chairman, because the fact is that the Railroad Commission is regulating an industry that is helping the state budget in the main so much. We're seeing that, we know anecdotally that the recession that the rest of the country had to endure, we endured with less pain as a result of the health of our economy, which itself was a byproduct of the energy industry in Texas. We'll have more money in the state budget this time probably than we've ever had before. The replacement of those dollars in the rainy day fund that are going to migrate out in some convoluted fashion to fund infrastructure stuff around the state, it'll be partly oil and gas that's going to put money back. I mean, it's really, this is the rocket booster of the state budget. If that's the case, why wouldn't the state want to take some of that additional money and pour it back into being sure that pipelines are safe? And
we haven't gotten any pushback,
I'd have to believe that no one would be in a position or would be disposed to push
No,
back.
and we had great support last cycle when we went and asked for dollars.
Yeah.
And so far this cycle, we'll see how the budget works out. But I think with new leadership, they're now beginning to focus on those issues. But we've had conversations, and frankly, the industry wants to be well regulated too. So they're behind us saying, no, put more dollars into that agency. They need more inspectors. They need more people over there. So it's and frankly, even people who aren't in this industry, but that are on the environmental side, want good inspectors. They want our data up to date.
Well, that's a little bit less of a surprise probably to the average person.
No, I think it's both.
To whom are you answerable? There are people who think that the Railroad Commission, again, just people say stuff, right? People think the Railroad Commission is basically a toady for industry or a lackey for industry, that somehow the Railroad Commission exists to facilitate industry's success. People will also say, well, it ought to be a watchdog agency. It ought to be looking out for the consumer protection. Where do you calibrate your role along the continuum?
I think we're a regulatory body, which means I'm answerable to the whole state. I get elected by the whole state, first and foremost. And for anybody who thinks we're just oil and gas centric, then they haven't paid attention that, frankly, I've been working with the ag people on property rights issues this cycle. They've been in my office. I've sat with them and talked about issues that are important to them. EDF's been in my office, and we have conversations too. I think that we should be answerable to everybody. And I think we are, quite frankly. When you look at, for instance, when you're talking about safety inspectors, it's not just safety. We're out there looking at and inspecting on a regular basis violations. I bet our fines have gone up demonstrably,
Right.
because we want to do things right, and that's a real philosophy at our agency, is to make sure that people are good operators,
Yeah.
and if they aren't, then we're going to find them.
One of the things that came up in the last cycle or two were Sunset Commission recommendations on reform for the Railroad Commission, and part of them got at this question of whether the perception, if not the reality, of the Railroad Commission was that it was essentially, kind of hand in hand with industry. And one of the things that came up were contributions from the companies who have business before the Railroad Commission or who are part of the industries that you regulate. Do you worry that, at least optically, there's a concern that the same industries supporting you all politically are also ones you regulate?
I think that you as a statewide elected official, you take contributions from everybody. That's part of it. It's a big state.
Yeah. Of course you don't have to.
You don't have to, but I would say.
And the suggestion in the Sunset Report was that maybe you shouldn't.
And that's a conversation to be had, but let me say they went through an ethics sunset this last cycle, and they could have done it to everybody in the state. So singling out just railroad commissioners,
Right.
I think, is a real problem. It doesn't matter if you're sitting in the chair or not. I think it ought to, if you're going to do that to one agency and one statewide elected official, you got to do it to everybody.
Right. So you're calling for it to happen to everybody.
If you're going to do it to one, do it to all and be fair.
Okay. The infrastructure issues we alluded to earlier. The fact is that while these communities are benefiting enormously economically from these shale plays, there are concerns about water in a state that has had challenges on the waterfront over the last few years. There are concerns about air quality. There are concerns, obviously, about roads. You get around Darrell Fowler or Joel Rodriguez or some of the county judges in the Eagle Ford area, you can't go 2 seconds without them bringing up the way that the roads have been impacted. You hear about social infrastructure concerns. These communities that have not had particularly good schools or particularly good health care or adequate emergency responders, now all of a sudden are seeing those social infrastructure challenges come to the fore. Do you think those are legitimate conversations to be having, and who should be ultimately responsible for beefing up social and physical infrastructure in these communities?
Well, I think they're legitimate because we're having them, and I think industry realizes there's a problem, by the way.
Right.
That's why you're seeing dollars come out of the rainy day fund for water, $2 billion last cycle. We just voted on highways,
right. But you understand, Chairman, that those dollars for water and transportation coming out of the rainy day fund are not a direct response to the shale plays.
No, they aren't, but they are. The reason we can put some dollars into those is because we have the shale plays.
Right.
So, no, they're going statewide. It'd be nice to see, and I hope the legislature again directs some dollars into those areas, because I think it's a challenge for counties with any kind of growth to keep up. But when you talk to industry, by the way, they are in process, and I think most of them are good and active in their communities that they're doing business, trying to give some dollars back to those communities.
So you think industry is proper to think of this as, at least in part, its responsibility?
I think in a lot of respects they are.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's a safety thing for them first and foremost. You're in South Texas on a hard-packed road with a truck. That's a safety issue for your driver, by the way. It's a safety issue for you if you don't have enough water, because you can't put out a fire if something happens, or you can't get if something happens, you can't get them to a hospital because there aren't enough first responders out there. So that's a challenge, but also I believe that industry overall wants to have good impact to communities. They're living in the communities. They want their kids to be able to go to school there, to get a good education. So I think it's a balancing act. There are a lot of industries in communities.
Right.
It'd be nice if we didn't just focus on Houston and Dallas when we're putting dollars into transportation. Yes, they've got huge growth.
Big population centers.
Big population. But the most dangerous road in the state right now is between Sterling City and Midland, Texas.
Is that right?
It is. And I won't get on it. Frankly, most of my family, we stay off of it. And they are in the process of widening it.
And that's because of the heavy truck traffic and the impact on the road that exists.
That's correct.
Right.
And they're in the process of widening it and putting some passing lanes. But these are some challenges all over the state, but particularly the Permian Basin in South Texas. And water, I think, is a good example of people wanting to do the right thing. And this is where I have to applaud the industry, and they're doing it themselves, by the way. And it's not just dollars, infrastructure dollars they're putting in. Across the state, they're using 1% of the state's water. It might be
Right.
more concentrated in places.
Well,
but
and
across
the
state.
fact is ag is using significantly more water as industries go than oil and gas.
That's correct.
Right, yeah.
But what technology's done for oil and gas and what companies themselves are spending the dollars on is this. They're figuring out, and we've put rules in place to help them, figuring out how to recycle flowback water. They're using brackish water, and a lot of companies are getting off of fresh water altogether. So they're using different things besides water, beginning to use technology to frack that isn't water-based. So they are figuring out the technology without us getting in the way.
Yeah. One of the things, if you talk to Judge Fowler or Judge Rodriguez or any of these other local people, what they'll say is, on the one hand, we think industry is benefiting so much from the work that they're doing financially that they've got the dollars and they have the moral responsibility to put back into the community. But the other thing you hear is that increasingly the state's view of these communities is, we're getting out of the business of paying for a bunch of stuff that we used to pay for. Mm-hmm. So cities, counties, school districts, hospital districts, this on you. And what you see is a lot of communities having to take on debt to do a lot of infrastructure work that once upon a time might have been the responsibility of the state. And they say, yeah, we're taking on the debt, but the population growth is what it is. We can't do anything about that. That's a good thing. We brag about that, but then there's a consequence of it, and state's not paying for stuff. So where should not just industry, but the state be putting its own hand in its own pocket to put money in?
And I think that's a challenge, and I think it's a legislative reaction to things. And that's not my job to figure that out, it's theirs.
No, but Chairman, you understand that there are people in your party, let me come back to you in the capacity of head of Victory and the Republican Party, election efforts. There are conservatives who on the one hand say, state's got to cut the budget, but on the other hand, they beat the crap out of all these people in the counties for daring to take on debt. They say, well, all these counties are getting so bloated with debt, that's terrible fiscal responsibility, when in fact it's born of the state getting out of the business of paying for some of this stuff and the inability of these communities to figure out how to accommodate the growth that they're seeing.
It is a challenge.
So can you tell those people to stop beating up the local people over their debt?
Well, and I think a big piece of it on all ends of it, whether it's state, county, city, companies are willing to invest, and I think the state might have to look at it again, but they want accountability. And that's a real challenge. So when you talk to those judges who are doing right by their counties, but they also just I've been told, not them specifically, but some county officials all over the state, just give us the dollars and we'll figure out what to do with them. And I don't think
it's a little bit like the state with healthcare, huh?
Well, I think that's right. In some respects, because if you're a private company and you are giving them dollars, you want some accountability. And frankly, if you're a big enough company, your shareholders want to know where the dollars are going to.
Right. What about the disposal well issue and more broadly the question of whether some of this activity that has been so good economically for the state is causing earthquakes, or the allegations are that there's been seismic activity? I know that the Railroad Commission just brought aboard somebody, is that right?
We did.
To focus specifically on this issue?
That's right.
What about that?
I think obviously if I had an earthquake in my neighborhood or at my house, I'd be concerned about it too, so first and foremost. Right. And I think we've done things pretty quickly for a state agency. Yeah. In January, there was a hearing up in Azle. As of April 1st, brought on a seismologist. He's a great guy from McCamey, but he worked at Sandia National Labs, probably one of the smartest people in the building now. Yeah. And he's worked with SMU and other think tank groups as well as companies. Quite frankly, companies have a risk factor for themselves too. So a lot of the companies who do business in and around Azle gave us information voluntarily. From that information and hearings the legislature had, we last week, or 2 weeks ago now maybe, implemented a rule at the Railroad Commission, had hearing, all the way through the process, about seismicity and injection wells, because we don't know the right answer. I don't know the right answer. I'm not a scientist. He is. But he advised us about some rules, and we've put them in place, and we think they're a good tool for us to use in case there is a problem.
So how much you say that part of the issue in Denton, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, part of the issue in Denton was either miscommunication or lack of communication. People in those communities don't have adequate information about what fracking is and is not, and therefore they're making decisions on the basis of just what they've heard. So it seems to me that the Railroad Commission has an opportunity, if not an obligation, to be that source of good information. That's right. So on the earthquake issue, so that people don't think, to borrow a phrase from this campaign, that you are Californiaing our Texas and bringing earthquakes to Texas, how do you do a better job of telling Azle and other communities, look, this is the reality of the safety questions. I mean, it seems to me that's a place where you all not only can step in, but should step in.
We have been,
Yeah.
frankly. That is our job. And anybody who had a complaint, we were up there inspecting it in 2 seconds, by the way.
Right.
That is our job.
Yeah.
But that was part of the reason we put rules in place, and I think we were proactive about putting rules in place. No other state at this point that we're aware of, at least within our contiguous area,
Yeah.
has put rules in place.
Right.
Oklahoma, they say they're ahead, but we're now ahead of them.
Well, we don't like Oklahoma.
No,
That's
we
why
do. We like Oklahoma.
No.
But I think we're being proactive as a state. Look, we want to have best practices and our rules in place, but you've got to look at the science too. You can't overreact to an issue until you have the science and the information too. And sometimes science takes a while to figure it out too.
So you're pro-science?
Absolutely, I think facts are.
Just look into the camera and say that. I'm pro-science.
I'm pro-science. I think we are a fact-based agency, and it is based on science and engineering. That's how we make decisions.
I think that may be the headline of this conversation, just there. We have just a couple minutes before we open it up for questions. Let me come back to you. So the Railroad Commission historically has been more of a leap pad than a lily pad. People get to the Railroad Commission and they seem to leave the car running professionally at the curb. I'm not even sure I could think of the last railroad commissioner who served an entire term. Now I'm looking at, maybe you'll tell me that Commissioner Porter has served an entire term. I don't actually know.
I can tell you about 10, but.
Okay, well, but you understand that the perception is that you guys get to the Railroad Commission and immediately the eye turns to other things. I can't help but notice that the number of statewide Republican elected officials who are women has dropped to 0 in the current cycle. Is that correct?
That's true. I'm going to be it by the end of
Just,
the year.
but just you. So everybody's going, ooh, Christi Craddick, maybe she should run for something else. So I wonder, are you having that conversation with yourself in the dark of night?
No.
No?
No, not
You're,
at this
you're
point.
taking it off the table?
I am going to be at the Railroad Commission. I have 4 more years.
Right, you're
left.
elected in 2012, so it's a 6-year term,
It's
so
a
you're,
6-year term.
2018. I can't help but notice that 2018 is the next statewide election cycle.
And we just had a huge election cycle. Do you think anybody's going to move at that point?
Oh, come on. Maybe. I mean, I know we've been used to people getting in office and staying there like they were cemented to their seats, but the reality is you're ambitious, you're 44. So there's a group of you, you're 44, Sitton is 43.
No, I think he's 39.
Is he 39?
Something. I don't
Hager
know.
is 43,
That's right.
and P. Bush is 40-ish or a little south of
39,
40.
38, 39.
So you're all the ones in theory in the on-deck circle swinging the bat with the donut, right? You're waiting to get in. I mean, I know you got a bunch of people who just got elected, but ambition has a tendency to push the cork up out of the bottle. You're not going to just sit here, are you? I mean, that's...
The Railroad Commission's a great place to be. I picked it, and the story in my family is this. You know that I did the back of the house, and I say the back
You
of the
did.
house for a long time.
You did.
And was never going to run.
And you got heck for it when you decided to run because, well, having been back of the house, you must be dirty,
That's right.
right?
And was I? No, I knew what I needed to do and work hard. I knew how to raise money and go out and work hard because I
Right.
was going to do it as well as I knew how to do it because I'd watched everybody do it for years.
Right.
But the joke in my house is this. The day that, or right before Michael Williams announced he was going to resign from the Railroad Commission, we got a phone call within my family. Michael's going to resign. Are you interested in the Railroad Commission? Not me, the other Craddick, by the way. The legislature had already started. He'd been sworn in, and he's like, I don't want to be at the Railroad Commission. I don't want to do it. He
Right.
walked in and told me, and I looked at him and I said, I want to run. Now, my mother was
You
getting...
didn't flinch.
No, I didn't. And my mother was getting ready to sit down in a chair and almost fell out of it because, and that is not, I mean, that's serious because I was never going to run for anything. I thought he was crazy to have run for anything.
Right.
But I think this is...
But you can understand why he didn't run. He's more powerful now than he would be as a railroad commissioner.
Absolutely. But he had no interest. He's done his service, and he loves it. He loves what he's doing.
Right.
But I know, because I grew up in it, I know the challenges being a public official.
Right.
But I think this is a service to the state. And one of the reasons that I wanted to run for the Railroad Commission, we hadn't had somebody there in a while who really wanted to be there.
Yeah.
And I really want to be there. I think this is a great industry. I think there are real opportunities for it to grow. And by the way, I think they do a horrible job in public relations, and I tell them that on a regular basis.
The Railroad Commission?
No, I think the industry does a horrible
industry
job.
does, yeah.
And I don't think the Railroad Commission's done a great job either. I think we're improving, by the way. But
Well, it would be good if people knew what you all did. Maybe you just change the name.
Well, that's a conversation to be had.
Right, yeah.
Legislative, well, they can have it, but until they change it constitutionally, I don't want to have the conversation.
So you're saying that you're not interested in something else, so are you announcing for re-election here?
There's a lot of change, and I have a little one at home. I may
Right.
decide I've done my service too.
6 and out, that may be it.
It may be it. We'll see where I am in 3 years.
I thought you handled this part of the conversation very well. All right, let's stop there. Let's give the chairman a hand. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good questions for the audience?
Absolutely.
Let me just say that may be the best interview I've had with a Craddick in 20 years.
I'll tell him you said
Well,
so, by the way.
He and I have a nice relationship now. Wasn't always the case. Let's open it up for questions. James and then Mr. Lindeman. Sir.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm James Labaugh. I've got a question about somebody that I think is one of the most powerful people in state finance we'd forgotten about, and that's King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. He affects the work we do, industry does, the entire state economy, and the state financial picture is going to be affected by what he decides to do. So my first question is, does he call you for advice? And then second, whether he does or not, how long and how far is Saudi Arabia going to go on what they're doing right now?
Well, you mentioned that the Saudis are actually having a disproportionate impact on our lives, right?
They are. And I think, right now we know OPEC meets in 2-3 weeks. I guess the Saudis are willing to take a $20 billion hit on a regular basis a month right now. They affect us, and where we have the opportunity to be energy independent and get off the sods is produce our own. But we've got to be able to export first and foremost, and we cannot do that right now. It's a conversation that needs to be had seriously in Washington, D.C. I don't think people understand it. When you talk about my name, people don't understand what I do in the Texas House, and we're an oil and gas state. People definitely don't understand what oil and gas does for the country on a federal level. And I think that's the real challenge we've got, and I think it's going to be an education process long term. But for us to really get off where the Sauds and OPEC control what's going on, we're bringing 500,000 barrels of oil a day less into this country from Saudi Arabia than we were at the beginning of the year. That's a problem for them.
To that point, the question of the federal government, and it's fashionable these days in Texas, almost to the point of being a cliche, to whack at the federal government like a piñata. How much of what the federal government does or does not do on this does impact your work? It seems less clear to me. It seems like we have a little bit more of a hand on our own business in the oil and gas respect here than some other state agencies may do with regard to federal involvement or lack of involvement.
We do. The challenge we're going to have, it's not me as an agency, it's the overall economy. Because right now, if you just look, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important to understand. If you look at Brent, which is everybody thinks the price of oil versus WTI, West Texas Intermediate, there's a gap. It's been as big as $14 of a gap. We've got restraints, shipping restraints coming out of the Permian Basin. Some of that's being, frankly, dealt with because pipes are being built as fast as they can be built. Yeah. But once you finish those restraints, and they're going to get fixed sooner rather than later, I'd say within the next year or so, then you've got restraints as you get into refining capabilities. We have refineries, they have capacity, but what they haven't done, because we haven't had enough WTI, light sweet crude in this country, is change the refining capacity. So they still have the capacity, but they're refining overseas crude and not our crude.
So there are things that can happen that would be useful. Are you having communications? Do you have communications with federal officials on this stuff?
We have a lot of conversations.
You have an open line of communication to, what is his name, Muniz, the secretary?
We don't, but where we have conversations, and we have conversations with some of their lower level people. Yeah. We have conversations with their regional EPA director. So as much as we all bash EPA and other federal agencies, we do have to work with them.
At the end of the day, you have to work with
right.
them. Great. Okay. Mr. Lindeman, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Commissioner. This is, in your other role, I have a question about the election here. And about the unexpected margins and outcome, again, congratulations. As the Texas Tribune reported, in 2011, as voter ID was going forward in the legislature, Senator Tommy Williams found that as many as 844,000 eligible voters would not have an acceptable ID under the law. So I'm wondering how much of the growth of the margins between Democrats and Republicans and the drop in the vote is due to voter ID?
I don't think we know the answer to that yet, and I have not personally heard of any complaints. We're 2 days out, and I don't think the analysis has been done, but nothing that we've heard of specifically at this point. So I think we'll see in the next week or two if it really did, but I haven't even heard Democrats complain about it at this point.
Generally, to the question of the drop in again, I alluded to this earlier, we were 36% according to one analysis in 2010, 51st out of the 50 states, behind the other 49 states and D.C., dead last in voter turnout. Inched up to 48th in 2012, fell back to last this cycle, according to stats I saw yesterday. I mean, I know you all won, but this is not good. This is from a democracy standpoint, if you're going to be totally corny about it. We have fewer people than any other state in the country paying attention to all these big issues. What do we do about this? And doesn't your party, despite winning these elections by 20 points or more, have an interest in seeing more people participate? And what are you all prepared to do about that?
And I think, yes, we think it's important, by the way. You know, when you've had every statewide elected official in the state for 20 years be Republican, there's some complacency and belief by the other party that they can't get very far, so they have no incentive to get out and vote.
Right.
And frankly, we can have a conversation how the Democrats ran their campaigns. I'd say they were not very they were poorly run to begin with. So they had no incentive to get out and vote for their people either.
Right.
But where we really, as Victory and Republican Party, have determined going forward, we can't quit. You know, historically, when we do Victory in the state, we gear up these offices, they do it for 4 months, and we shut them down, and
Right.
everything's done.
Right.
Part of the goal for me this cycle, and Steve Ministeri's an incredible chairman of the party. I think he's one of the best chairmen we've had in 30 years probably, or 25. But he had a vision, as frankly did the Abbott campaign and every statewide elected official, to keep Victory going. So part of what we did fundraising is to make sure these offices are not going to shut down and to continue building on what we started this cycle.
Yeah.
And I think that will help our voter turnout going forward. And frankly, you know, we always have some drop in the midterms, but we're all concerned about the vote. We all looked at it. We were all concerned, frankly, in Harris County. That was an area, battleground Texas, we thought was going to really carry the day and do a lot of work down there. And about 2 weeks ago, everybody got concerned that voter turnout was lower than we anticipated and that the judges below on the down ballot. This is about a down ballot issue. The top of the ticket's going to win well for the next few years. It's the down ballot where
Right, but straight ticket
challenges.
voting is such a, I mean, if you look at the consistency of the vote totals across the statewide offices, there's no way that people deliberately voted for Jim Hogan at the same level that they deliberately voted for Wendy Davis. That's straight ticket.
But they do down ballot. If you go look down ballot, and I'm talking judges. I think, look, that's how Republicans took control of the state, is we won down ballot and then went up.
Right.
So I think that's where the opportunity, if I was a Democrat looking at it, I wouldn't worry about running statewide. I'd run the down ballots. It's what they've done in Dallas County, where we made some better inroads this cycle, and it was a concerted effort in Dallas County to work on some judges and
you beat
countywide.
Craig Watkins.
We did.
That chair could have beat Craig Watkins.
No, it was, did you look at the numbers? It was
Well,
a
I
hard
looked at the
fought.
numbers, but for Craig Watkins to lose, it wasn't about Craig Watkins being a Democrat or Craig Watkins, it was about being Craig Watkins.
Potentially, but he still had to have a credible, good candidate.
Which he did. All right,
Run
fair,
against him.
Fair. Other questions? Oh, Mr. Makoviak, I'm sure this will be a great one. I'm also sure it'll be a bipartisan question. What?
Low expectations, I guess,
Yeah.
Evan, yes. One of the emotional arguments you hear is that fracking pollutes groundwater. I'm sure this is something you hear a lot. Love to hear your answer when you hear that.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say you disagree.
I would say this because look, we regulate it. If there's a problem, I'm going to go out and shut you down.
Right.
We have, in the history of the state, for fracking, not had an example any place in the state, period, where fracking has polluted groundwater. Period.
Never.
Not fracking.
Okay, so environmentalists who may be watching this or watching it after, if you have an instance in which this is not the case, step forward. But you're prepared to say, never had an instance.
And where fracking has polluted
Where
groundwater.
fracking
in
has
the
polluted
state. That's
groundwater.
correct.
Okay, that's pretty conclusive.
And I would say this.
That's bold.
It is, and it's true. But not,
Yeah.
and it's science-based. But not only that, one of the things that we've done in the past 2 years is update our casing and well integrity rules to make sure, as new technology comes on board, that we don't have
Indeed,
any
that is
problem.
definitely
That
part of
is
the
correct.
conversation. Other questions?
This is an easy crowd. Oh, I don't think you can ask questions.
All right, Gaylor, what do you got?
As you suggest, Christi, there's been a lot of evolution over the years. The Railroad Commission, some of us going back to the Byron Tunnel days, Ben Ramsey, et cetera. And I'm very curious. You're very experienced in the political and the oil and gas area, and you know what state agency regulation's all about. What was the biggest surprise you had once you took office as member of the Railroad Commission?
I think the biggest challenge, I don't know if there was a big surprise, the biggest challenge we have and continue to have is keeping and finding good qualified people. That's a real challenge. You've got an aging of an industry and new folks. So when you talk about that generation, we haven't had an industry in this country for 20 plus years.
Also, I have to believe a lot of people are looking at working at the Railroad Commission and working in the industry and going, I get paid more over there.
That's right. Yeah, and it's salary. You know, we pay a first-year engineer $40,000. They're going to the private sector, they're getting paid $100,000 plus. So it's competing for new people. But it's also, we've got a bunch of retirees, and they're retiring. And they may or may not be going and working for industry, but they're flat out retiring. So we're losing the knowledge base and the history. And the new folks that we've got great people coming in. I think we've got a lot of good people at the Railroad Commission because they want to be there, quite frankly. People are proud of working at the Railroad Commission, and they like the name, by the way, at the agency. So that's a real challenge for us. But I think that that's our biggest challenge. And you hear about it, we knew it was a problem, but I think I didn't realize the big challenge. When I got here in Midland, for instance, we have 35 available jobs in Midland, Texas. We had 14 openings because people were either getting hired by industry quickly, or the other thing that's happening in some of these areas, they don't have to be an administrative assistant because their spouse or partner is making so much in the oil field that they can go home and don't have to work. So that's our ongoing challenge, I think. Any surprises? No, I think hopefully I knew, but I learn every day too.
So I'm going to take the last question before we wrap up here. We have a presidential campaign that has already started, you may have heard. We will have between 2 and 5 people who grew up in Texas running for president. Thank you, Jesus. From the journalism perspective, this is Christmas every day, or will be for the next 2 years. Who are you for? You've got Ted Cruz and Rick Perry. You've got a guy named Bush who may run. Bushes have ties to Midland, so that's a little bit of the hero in his own hometown kind of thing. Who are you for? Help us sort this out.
I don't have a favorite yet. I think
you have.
I really do not. I know them all. I've known them all for years.
Right.
And I think that we're going to see how it shakes out starting in January and see where they go.
So you might support somebody over your sitting United States Senator or your former governor?
I don't know that I'll support anybody. It depends on where their positions are and what they're running on too.
Right.
I mean, where I think they're going to lead this country. I think that's a really important thing. If we're going to be business as usual, and we'll see what Congress does, hopefully they're not, but we need a leader in this country, and I think we've got to see where those values are and what they decide to do, what they want to do.
Very diplomatic answer.
Very true, though.
Okay, good. Let's give Commissioner Craddick a hand. Thank you very much. All right, thank you, ma'am.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Evan.
I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. Thanks. Okay.